The European Union is surviving with a crippling dilemma, a former Brexit Party MEP claimed in a recent report as she exposed Brussels' critical identity crisis. Britain left the EU on January 31 but remains in a transition period until the end of the year. During this time, the UK abides by the bloc's rules on issues such as trade and free movement while London and Brussels negotiate a future deal. While the EU permits for the transition to be extended for up to 2 years, in December the UK Parliament passed a bill which enshrines the exit date in law. If a deal is not struck, then the two parties will trade on World Trade Organization (WTO) terms. However, with both the UK and EU under lockdown during the coronavirus pandemic, in-person Brexit talks have been put on hold and many are urging Prime Minister Boris Johnson to extend the transition period. Despite the logistical challenges of conducting sensitive discussions via video conference, Downing Street insists negotiations will go ahead. According to several sources, it is now operating under the impression that the UK is heading for no deal. As the country is about to begin its new chapter outside the European bloc, former Brexit Party MEP Lucy Harris shed light on her time in Brussels in a recent report for the Eurosceptic think tank Red Cell titled after Rue Belliard. In the report, Ms. Harris reflected on how the EU works and exposed a critical identity crisis in the bloc. Despite being a democratic institution, the former MEP suggested, democratically elected MEPs who resent its very existence can almost never voice their views. She wrote, with the European Parliament, debate is a facade. Rather than listening and responding, MEPs often just try to shame each other in their opinion rather than addressing the actual issues and concepts the debate is supposed to conjure. To vote, MEPs use a voting sheet with symbols that represent for, against, and abstain on a button panel. The voting lists are massive and you go through the votes at breakneck speed. Sometimes merely putting your arm up is enough to vote. But the speed and the insufficient method of putting your hand up also misses the actual outcome of votes, and we have to vote again. Other times, calls from MEPs for a re-vote are ignored. The lack of a democratic rigorous process was persistently obvious. The former MEP added, ultimately you really have to ask if there is such growing Euroscepticism within the EU Parliament, who constantly criticize your institution, does that mean you don't allow enough criticism within the system? Do you allow for dissent? Do you allow for change? If so, perhaps there would not be such a successful streak of political critics who act to undermine your authority. Ms. Harris concluded that the very fact the EU has swaths of MEPs within the European Parliament, who build their careers on the rejection of the institution, suggests there are not enough democratic mechanisms for change within it.